Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think it will be time for us to continue our day of conference, and we will be now moving to a conversation with our second guest speaker for today, Jill Dougherty, who has served as CNN correspondent for 3 decades, reporting from more than 50 countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, China, North Korea, and Russia, but her chief area of interest and expertise is Russia and the post-Soviet region. Jill is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She is also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and a CNN contributor who provides expert commentary in Russia. And in discussion with her today, we have our dear friend, Masha Lipman. Masha served as editor or deputy editor of many Russian language publications. She worked for years at the Moscow Carnegie. She wrote for the Washington Post and the New Yorker. She also edited with us here the English journal Point and Counterpoint, and she's now in charge of the Ponars Eurasia podcast, also in charge of a new initiative we will be launching soon called Russia.post, and she's a visiting fellow here at IRIS. Both Jill and Masha, thank you so much for being here today, two good friends of Ponars and the Institute, so we are really delighted to have you here today for a discussion on the current situation. Jill, I give you the floor to begin.
Well, I am really glad to be here, and I'm very glad that, I have to turn it on, that would help. Very glad to be here and very thankful to Marlene that she invited me to participate in this, because Ponars to me is the premier group that looks at Russia and the Soviet space. And I'm extremely happy to be here with Masha Lipman. I think Masha is going to have a few words. Masha and I go back a long time. And yet we saw each other, as I think you're going to talk about, just a few weeks ago. Maybe, well, actually now it's probably 2 months, the very beginning of the Ukrainian war in Ukraine, in Moscow. And the subject, I'm going to try to focus on young people, but young people in Russia. And it's a place that I know the best. And I do think that even given the fact that Ukraine is being destroyed, at least physically, not, I would say, as a country or a unified people, but Russia too is being destroyed in some ways. At least society is being very seriously damaged, and that's what I'd like to get into. But Masha, maybe you want to say a few words and we'll have a discussion.
Yeah, I would start with thanks for this institution. For people.
Oh, is the mic on? Did you?
Yeah, is it working now? Yeah. So I would like to start with my sincere thanks, my gratitude to this institution, to our dear colleagues and friends here, who once again are not only employing me since 2014 actually, but also greeted me very cordially when I got here not a long time ago after leaving Russia to Moscow. It is my very special pleasure to introduce Jill Dougherty, freelance reporter so many years, Marlene mentioned so many different places where Jill worked. And Jill's career has been connected with Russia ever since actually before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Actually, I think at least a decade before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a very long time connection to Russia, to the Soviet Union, to Russia after that. Okay, which puts you in an excellent situation to look at today's Russia and what is going on there. As Jill mentioned, we last saw each other. Actually, I think it was one day before the war. And we were sitting ironically in what used to be Гостиница Украина, Hotel Ukraine in Moscow. And this happens to be the neighborhood where I also live, or should I say lived, until recently. And again, ironically, this whole neighborhood has Ukrainian names. There is the street where my apartment is called Kievskaya улица, Kiev Street, and there is the Ukrainsky Boulevard, Ukrainian Boulevard, and other street names in that neighborhood, all connected with Ukraine. So quite ironic, I think. As far as I recall, we were talking, and that was obvious at the time, about whether there would be war. And there was every indication that there would be war. However, like so many other observers, we were telling each other that it was still impossible to fathom, impossible to imagine Russia invaded Ukraine. And yet the next day, I think it invaded, and of course we didn't see each other after that, and I left very soon after that, and you left probably in early March yourself, that's right?
Yes.
Okay. It is my very special pleasure to give the floor to Jill now. She will talk about, I think, the Russian youth and her studies in the perceptions, the attitudes of young Russians. After that, I will ask Jill a few questions, and then we will go to the audience for more. Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Masha. When you were saying I left because I did leave right a little after you did, the reason I left was because of that new law that was passed, which is the Don't Say War law by Putin, which, as you probably have heard about, it means that if you use the word war or you cite any information that comes from a source other than the government or the military, you could be liable to 15 years in prison. And so that was a good time, I think, for many Western journalists, myself among them, although I'm not fully with CNN. I was with them for 30 years, so I get a pass, I guess. But to leave, because it was really literally impossible to figure out what you could say without running afoul of that law. So it was a very serious time. And when I left with a lot of sadness, because a long time ago, back in 1969, I was an exchange student in Leningrad. And then I had a career that, was connected with Russia in various ways. So the idea, which is still active now, that I might not be able to go back, that they might not want to give me a visa, is very sad to me. But back to, Russian young people. Even though I left CNN on a full-time basis in 2014, of course, a great year that we all know when Crimea was annexed, but during that time, I continued to go back, and CNN would send me back for periods, a month or two when things happen. So I've been going back on a regular basis for semi-extended periods ever since about 2014. And when I went back in 2011, 2012, that may ring a bell, I'm sure, with many of us, because that was a period of protests that were called the Bolotnaya protests. I'm going to move this so you can hear it a little bit better. So those were the protests with a number of people, but I noticed even at that point, we were on the streets recording, taking pictures, doing videotape, that there were a lot of young people. And I just noted it at the time. Then in 2017, I was back again. And this time there were a lot of protests on the street. They were organized by Navalny, the protest leader. And I kept running into 17-year-olds. It was very strange, but literally almost everybody that I kind of ended up talking with or questioning was about 17 years old. And I was very intrigued because I thought, what are they doing on the streets when they're 17? Do they know what this is about? What are they demanding? What do they think of Putin? What do they think of Russia itself? And I remember there were a couple of takeaways, there were many, but I remember two things. One was a young kid, and I asked him, "Why are you here?" And he said, "They just don't respect us." And I thought, that was so undefined, but it was a very, I think, prescient explanation for why he was there. Because it literally was that the government didn't seem to respect the interests or the futures of these young people. And when we talked about, are you anti-Putin? It was really not what I expected. I thought he'd say, yes, of course, I'm anti-Putin. But it wasn't that. It was more, Putin, that old guy, yeah, I guess, doesn't really have too much to do with my life, but I don't like him that much. And so that surprised me because there was not a lot of vehemence in that comment. Then, one more thing that happened during those protests. We were taking pictures, and Tverskaya Street, one of the main streets, was filled with people. And I wanted to get a big, wide shot of the street to show the size of the protest. So I saw people on a balcony on Tverskaya Street, and I said, "Hello, привет, можно к вам?" And they said, "Yeah, come on up." So we went up, and we took pictures from the balcony. It turned out to be a workspace, kind of like the things that we have here in DC, a workspace that you can rent space and have some coffee, talk with friends. And so while the crew was taking pictures, I went into another room and I was looking down at the street. And I remember this young kid coming in, maybe 18, maybe 19 years old. And he sat on the balcony. And at that point, they were singing the Russian national anthem. That was very interesting. And he was singing along by himself. Of course, he ignored me because I had gray hair, so therefore I don't exist as a person who doesn't really make any difference as old lady. And but he was singing along, and I thought with great passion and great feeling, and that surprised me too. So what I drew from that, and then I talked with other people later, that there was a fair amount of patriotism, Russian patriotism, that these kids really did love Russia. And what they felt, and I'm just kind of quoting what many of them said, yes, we do love Russia. We want Russia to succeed, and we want a place in Russia, but we don't feel that we can do it here. And so those were my kind of takeaways. So when I came back, I eventually kind of invented a course for Georgetown that I call the Putin generation. And I remember a friend of mine, Lilia, saying, there's no such thing as a Putin generation. So forget that. That's an idiotic title. But I kept thinking, but there are these young people, and they were defined by me and others as the generation that had grown up with no leader other than Vladimir Putin. So they're roughly 20 years old. Now it was probably, we can debate whether I should have called it the Putin generation, but it was a good tag, and people were interested in that title, hence they wanted to sign up for my course. So I kept it, in spite of what our friends said. So that course, I wanted to find out who are these young people. At that time, there was some research being done. This is going back to like 2017 and after. And the person that I kind of focused on, and this would be for anyone who's interested in reading up on that generation, her name is Yelena Omelchenko. And she is from St. Petersburg, Omelchenko. And she's in St. Petersburg. She's at the Center for Youth Studies at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg. And she has done a lot of research, and she pulled together in a book that came out just last year, which is exactly Youth in Putin's Russia. And it pulls together a lot of research that's been done on this young generation. And then also, there were other studies, the Levada Center, which I'm sure many of you know about. Denise Volka from Levada was doing quite a few polls about young people, their views on society, et cetera. So I began to look at their research. I knew Maria Snegavaya, who many of us know. She was doing research with SIPA and Center for European Policy Analysis and the Levada Center. And the Atlantic Council was doing a lot. But I think it was very important for me to see the Russian research in this. So I put together this course. And I guess what I'll do is give you the very basic ideas that I came away with the caveat that I do think, and this is kind of spoiler alert, but I do believe that things are changing. And they're changing because of this war. And they're changing because young people are leaving. And considerable numbers, the estimates as the war was kind of taking place at the beginning were that some 200,000 people had left. Now, I have to think it is more. And the estimates that I heard from people who were kind of in the know about how many people might ultimately leave it could be up to 500,000. Nobody knows at this point, but these are big numbers, obviously, for numbers of people who are leaving. Not all of them are young, but a number are. So there is some research that Masha introduced me to, and I'll get that at the end, which is from OK Russia. Very interesting site. I think it's only in Russian, right? I believe. Okay. Yeah, for the time being, but it's called okrussia.org, and you can check that out. So, what did I find from this research? Essentially, these are really the first fully post-Soviet generation. They are more liberal, or maybe I should use past tense. At that point, they were more liberal, more opposition-minded. They comprised 20 to 30% of the protesters on the streets of the big cities from 2011 to 2019. So that's a pretty good proportion. They have access to various sources of information. And of course, the biggest one is the internet. You could call them the internet generation. There's no question, because that has transformed their views about their society and really about the world. One effect of that, being on the internet and not watching television. In fact, I remember talking just recently with a young person when I was in Moscow. And I said, so do you ever watch TV? And she said, no, I haven't had a TV since about 7 years ago. Yeah, she physically doesn't have a TV. So there are a lot of young people who are on the web, and therefore they are less exposed to Kremlin propaganda. And I can tell you, if you thought there was propaganda on Russian TV 2 months ago, right now it is splashная propaganda. It is absolute propaganda 24 hours a day. I say this with great sadness, but it is just constant, anti-Ukrainian, we can get into that later, but it really hideous anti-Ukrainian propaganda, and very much rah, rah, we are going to win and the world hates us. So back to the young people. They are also less paternalistic, which means that at that time, while these studies were taking place, they were more apt to want to start a business, which was also very interesting. They did not expect as much support from the state, although that number is higher than in the West, there's no question. But still, they wanted to kind of do their own thing, start companies. And the number of young people under 25 who support human rights also was twice as high as the number who support the priority of state interests. It's kind of a funky explanation, but basically their support for human rights is much higher than among older Russians. There's definitely a generation gap here. They're more open to the world. They have greater knowledge of foreign languages. They read books, they watch movies. They're on all of the social media. Definitely, watching many of the things and exposed to many of the memes and TikTok and Facebook, Twitter, and especially Instagram, and then YouTube, which is really I would say, the television for young people in Russia. That's where you get a lot of the bloggers and bloggers who are doing that. They had also at that point, they had a more positive view of the West, which you might expect. Many of them were traveling to the West, and in particular Europe. That's very different from their parents and certainly their grandparents. And then support, at least at that point, around 2018, for Putin was diminishing at that point. There were a number of reasons. One of them was the living standard being hit more. And also, if you remember that period when they started changing the retirement age, and that was, even though it affected older people, it did affect young people because they looked at their parents and their grandparents who were going to be hurt by these new retirement laws. So even though it's a little counterintuitive, why should they care? They did care because many of them still live with their parents. Then, yes, so at that point, 60% of young Russians had a positive attitude toward the EU and the United States, compared with only 30% who were over 65. So that's a huge, huge difference. Now, those are kind of big, broad views, but there were more subtle aspects to this, and I'll just get into this because I think it's important. They were plugged in to a lot of things, but they were strangely apolitical. And that I think will come up when Masha and I talk. They also knew very little about Stalin's repressions. Among 18 to 24-year-olds, 46% knew nothing about it, about that time, even though their grandparents might have been in the Gulag. A lot of them just did not know about this, which is also kind of an odd thing. And 2/3 of them could not describe their political views. They just did not know how to describe them. Now, there were, and few of them voted. That's the other thing. So again, getting kind of apolitical. Then there were focus groups, and I think this is the stuff from the Levada Center. There were focus groups at the time, and this is up until relatively recently, that showed that many young Russians who took part in these focus groups argued that Russia, even though they were fitting this definition of kind of more positive toward the West, they thought that Russia should remain sovereign, a separate territory, be independent of international structures. So this is a little bit different, and it is not a contradiction in terms or counterintuitive. It actually goes with the territory, and it might be, that kid who was singing along with the national anthem, who's nonetheless very patriotic. So these are things a little bit harder for me, I guess, as a Westerner to understand, but I think I get it. They also, and this to me is crucial, and this is what I'd love to talk about. They are probably rooted in opinions popular among the Russian youth that no one is expecting Russians in the West, and they don't like us there. It's a very, I think it's a strong feeling, it's an emotional feeling, and I think it's growing. And then finally, there was some research by Kadri Leek, who is from Estonia. I think a number of you probably know about her as well. She does some excellent research. She did a very interesting study, and it's actually from 2018, but it's very current in my mind. It was called The Last of the Offended, Russia's First Post-Putin Diplomats. And she looked at students at MGIMO, which is basically the foreign policy, kind of like the foreign service of the foreign ministry university. And she came up with many of those same views. So here's a quote from some of the students that she was talking to. The US wants to stop our development in order to sustain the status quo and their hegemony. They are drawn, so these students are drawn to realpolitik. They don't feel that Russia has any permanent either friends or foes. And they feel that the West treated Russia like a loser after the end of the Soviet Union. And what Kadri Lik came away with is these students, who many of them want to go into the Foreign Service. They had a strong need, a need for a strong leader. They felt that the country was too big to give full rights to everybody. This is too big to manage. So democracy, maybe later. And they have seen, oddly enough, they've seen more of the West than older Russians. And because of that, they are somewhat more cynical. In other words, like when I grew up, and I worked for the Voice of America, so I was broadcasting in Russian to the old Soviet Union. And there were people that, and I went on US Information Agency exhibits, and I remember the feeling of people. And when I was an exchange student, which is, well, you know, the United States really is an interesting place, and we know it's better, people live better. We don't exactly know how, but there was kind of an idea that the United States was special in spite of all of the propaganda they were exposed to. And ironically, now that young Russian people can get to Europe and can get to the United States, they see the problems that are in the United States and Europe, racial disparities, economic disparities. And so they come back and they're, I'm not going to say jaded, but they are not, you know, kind of longing to breathe free in the United States. They like the West. They feel the West works better and functions better and is ultimately more democratic. But there's a certain cynicism that exists. And I've seen that. I did some research in Estonia a few years ago at the ICDS. And I was speaking with Russian speakers in Estonia, and I came away with much of that same feeling among some of the Russian speakers, especially in Narva. I know that one of our colleagues is from Narva, and it's complicated a little bit more. So I will leave you. There are a few more things that I'll go through really fast. Some of the comments that Kadri Lik came up with are very similar to me to what Putin is saying right now about the Ukraine war. The West is trying to destroy Russia. Check. There are plots by foreign spies. Check. And then you have directly from Russia right now, the plot against Vladimir Solovyov, one of the biggest propagandists on TV. Remember President Putin's scum and traitors speech. You know, internal people, internal Russians who are against this war are ultimately scum and traitors. These are all in quotes, of course. And don't forget, like, as I experienced, and now unfortunately Russians are, a lot of the outlets that are for information that they were getting, Facebook, basically shut down in Russia. Instagram basically shut down. They love to shut down YouTube. I'm not quite sure whether it's still functioning, but that's kind of next on the hit list. Many social media outlets, some of the ones that they keep, like, Telegram, they only keep because the government broadcasts and tweets and does things. They keep it because the Russian government can communicate on those, but believe me, they would shut them down if they could, but they need them. So I'll end on this last quote, or last piece of data. The Levada Center, March of 2021, so a year ago. The view of the US, this is generally not all young people. The view was 40% positive and 42% negative. So kind of split. Right now, March of 2022, view of the US, 17% positive, 72% negative. So it has really deteriorated. And I think this raises many different questions. So I'm eager to get into the discussion with Masha, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. My first question is a very easy one, actually. You cited data from polling firms, including the Father Center. In your experience, how much experience do you have with Russian people outside of Moscow and maybe St. Petersburg and big urban centers? Or are you totally based, as far as that part of Russia is concerned, on polling data and focus groups data from other sources?
Well, when I was working with CNN, and I was there for almost a decade as bureau chief, we would go all over the place. And we went over, I mean, really former Soviet states, I'd say. So we did get to smaller towns, did get to a few villages, but we were traveling quite a bit. That diminished as time went on. It became harder to do that. And then most recently, when I go back to Russia, since I'm not really a working journalist, it's very difficult to get to smaller places. So I rely on polling data and people that I speak to, and I'm sure you have much more understanding of what is happening across Russia. The polling data, well, I'll just say the polling data might anticipate a question. I know a lot of people say, can you trust polling data? I tend to trust Levada Center because I do think they use accepted methods of collecting data, but I do think right now it is extraordinarily difficult for Russians to talk about what they really feel. Because, you can be, there's the case of the man who was actually speaking on his phone and somehow was intercepted, and he was critical of the war and he got into trouble. So I think a lot of Russians are very reluctant to speak openly about what they feel about the war. But maybe trends. Denise Volker has said, at least, and he's very aware of that too. He said, at least there are trends you can kind of look at and believe are happening.
Yeah, indeed. This conversation of whether one can trust polling data at the time of war is a very important one discussed among Russian scholars as well as, I'm sure, scholars on this end. Of course, you mentioned that the data you are mostly based on is the data coming from before the war. And as you mentioned in the very end, with that data, our perception of the West, it's pretty obvious how the perceptions have changed. I would ask you about a poll taken recently, which actually shows, I think, poll to poll, not all polls are taken by the Lipman Center or state-affiliated firms. There have appeared several independent polls lately, several groups that have been doing polling of their own. What we see, I think, universally in all of them is a difference in the attitude to the war between younger Russians and older Russians, and the difference is quite significant. However, if a question is asked to what extent that in various ways is asking people whether they are interested, we also see much less interest, significantly less interest among the young. This applies to questions such as what are the most important events of the month that you can remember? Of course, the war is number one universally, regardless of the age groups, but still the percentage of younger people who remember to name the war as the most important event of the month is much lower than that of the older people. How would you explain that based on your experience, the course that you're teaching, and the data that you're based on?
It does sound strange, doesn't it? But I think when I was trying to figure out how do they get information, first I started with the question, how do they get news? And then I realized they don't always get news, they get information. And information can come in various ways. For instance, a very, very influential vlogger is Yuri Dudz. Yuri Dudz is a fantastic Russian journalist. And he has a vlog on YouTube, which now you can't get in Russia. In fact, I think he might have, well, I think it still exists, but was recently shut down in Russia. He has 10 million followers. He is extremely influential. And the type of information that he gets it's not necessarily breaking news, that the way that perhaps the older generation who sits down and watches TV and sees the news and what happened today. But he was talking about the war. And that's why the Russian government shut him down very, very recently, because he did a very interesting vlog and talking with a writer and about, the idea of war and why Russia goes to war. And so I think young people are getting information, but it may not be, hard and fast news the way perhaps older people are getting it. And that may kind of explain a little bit about it. Plus, they are essentially apolitical because they feel, for the most part, they feel that, voting is a sham, that nothing really changes. And even sometimes they feel that protests don't change anything. So they're disconnected from some of the news. That doesn't mean that they don't have aspirations for their future. Does that seem to answer? It's a little squishy, but that would be my explanation.
Okay, so you were talking about how the perception of the West has changed from generally positive, or at least slightly over half positive, to generally negative. When the perception was still positive among the young people, and again, the answers to this question varied a great deal regarding depending on the age group. What do you think was so attractive for the young people in the West before the war? Was it democracy? Was it wealth? The ability to find well-paying jobs, what have you? Or was it rather things such as gadgets, music, film, games, of course? And since the perception has changed so much, is it that today, when they are answering this question about the West, they're thinking about something entirely different than when they were asked the same question before the war?
That is a great question, Masha. I think it's more the latter. I kind of alluded to this, but my impression is that Russian young people, let's say that they traveled to the West. So what did they see? They have kind of, let's say they go to Europe. They see, societies that look as if they're living quite well. And I think that's important. Things function, banks function, police don't stop you and shake you down for a bribe. Things seem to work well. There's also a sense of more openness and freedom, and I'm just going to use that word in the sense of freedom to do what you want to do. You can travel, you can go to other places, you can buy gadgets, you can buy the latest technology, which is very, very attractive to young Russians. I do not think that they go there for, I'm going to call it Jeffersonian democracy, for the most part. Some might, but I think it is much more practical and transactional than it is theoretical. I don't think that they are going because the West is free. Maybe their grandparents had kind of a concept that actually was more like that, freedom in the West. But I think with the young people, they go because they like it, they have friends there, they can travel, they can see things, a different way of life. They're very attracted to culture, music, all sorts of, broad ideas of culture, which is all part of society. I think so that idea of, I just had a thought about that. Oh, I know. I'll give you an example. that this goes back a little bit, but this was so illustrative to me. I mentioned that I did some research in Estonia in 2014. So this is going back a little bit. And I remember meeting a young Estonian who is Russian by extraction, speaks Russian, speaks Estonian, lived in Narva, in fact. And he had a gray passport. And I'm not going to get into all of the things, but you know, you can have kind of a European type of passport, or you can actually have, I think, a Russian passport. There's a gray passport that allows you to go to Russia and to Europe. He had a gray passport. And I said, why do you have a gray passport? Because I thought of that as older people who, you know, didn't speak Estonian and didn't kind of feel that they were part of society. They might. And he said the reason he had it was because he wanted to, he had a business that he had started. He was about 26. He went to St. Petersburg for business. He went to Europe for business, and he lived in Estonia. And I naively said, but what about values? You know what I mean? What about democracy? And he said, it's not that important to me, quite honestly. I mean, my business is important to me, but not these ideas that you're talking about. So that was my first personal introduction to a different way of looking at values. To him, it really wasn't that important, things that are important to me and maybe to some other people. I'm not criticizing him, I'm just saying that that's a different way of looking at things.
Okay, so let's talk about propaganda a little bit. So you mentioned propaganda across the board, propaganda everywhere, every word of state TV is propaganda these days, and this is certainly true. You also mentioned that young people do not watch television, but you also mentioned that there's been quite a shift in perceptions of the West, and not only of the West, since the war began. So what is it that makes young people change their mind so significantly, if not propaganda? I would also point out that aside from what television does, and aside from propaganda probably 24 hours a day, these days, there is a concerted effort on the part of the Russian authorities or the Russian government to inculcate appropriate perceptions on the young people specifically, or should we say brainwash young people. This applies to school children, this applies to college students. This is quite an effort that is nationwide. School teachers are given instructions and even scripts, maybe what they should say to school children, and college professors are assigned, are mandated of doing the same. So do you think that it is this that's working, or do you think that this might be something else? Inculcation, or maybe something that is I hate to say it, a natural shift of opinion in a country of war?
Yeah, I think there's no question that propaganda, even though these young people are not really watching TV, their parents are, you know, and they come home and they discuss these things. And then, as Masha mentioned, in schools, almost everywhere you look, you know, in Moscow now, the symbol for the war, the Z, seems to be everywhere. On social media, there have been pictures of young people going into formation in a Z, you know, in support of the war. And so I think you're living in a society surrounded by this. It's to me, it would be very hard to get away from it if you live in that society. I do think that that patriotism that I was talking about, you know, there's a natural thing. Think of the United States during 9/11. There's a natural kind of rally around the flag, even though the narrative is different, and maybe some young people don't support or don't accept that narrative. But I do think there is a tendency to kind of, again, rally around the flag and support your country, especially when you are told that it's not only Ukraine. This is where we get into real propaganda. You are told by the government that Ukraine is a weapon being used by the West, by NATO and the United States to attack Russia. And that narrative goes way back. I can remember doing a story on the Nashi group, which was a youth organization a number of years ago. And they were talking about the United States invading Russia, even at that point, taking its natural resources and taking over the country. So people have grown up with this. And I think, certain ideas like that get triggered, that people want to be, supportive of their government. I think it is just a natural thing.
Thank you. So let us talk about immigration. You mentioned that actually young people are the bulk, account for a majority of those who have left Russia since the beginning of the war. What are their motives? How do you see them, and how diverse do you think they are?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start with, since I'm kind of a journalist, I'll start with the immediate, like an example, and then I'll kind of back it up, because your study, the OK Russia study, is very, very interesting. But when Masha and I saw each other in Moscow, I saw some friends who were Russians, and they were primarily young, people that I had been associated with or knew, worked with, or just were friends with. And I had coffee with them, et cetera. This is about a handful, 5 or 6 people. All of them have left. Every single one has left. And one was a journalist. He left because he really felt that he was going to be attacked, that his family might personally be attacked. That journalists were being physically threatened. An old colleague of mine, Alexei Venediktov, who ran Echo Moscow Radio, who happens to be Jewish, found a severed pig's head in front of his door. And there have been other cases like that. So my friends, the reason they were leaving is they felt that it was probably safer to leave. And I know there are some very brave people who are also my friends who stayed, and I am in awe of some of them, like Zhenya Albatz, staying. It could be physically very dangerous, Look at what happened to Muratov, the head of Novaya Gazeta, who had red paint and acetone or something thrown in his face. So they left because they felt that they had to. Now, if you look at broader questions, and I should mention, they left not because they wanted to. They did not want to leave, and they intend to go back if they can. And they left with the intention that they would try to help Russia wherever they ended up. So that's the mentality. Now, the study that you were looking at, the OK Russia study, that was very interesting because this is broader. And I would urge everybody to check that website because it's very interesting. They say that the average age of people who are leaving is 32. And the average age of Russians in general is 46, considerably younger. And they tend to be very highly educated. 80% of them have higher education, according to that study. Only 27% of Russians overall have higher education. They buy expensive technology. I was going through this thinking, how does this kind of compare with the information I had before? 46% of them, so roughly half of them, buy expensive technology. And you won't be able to buy much expensive technology in Russia going forward because of the sanctions. Only 26% of Russians do that, so almost double. They definitely speak more foreign languages. 93% of them, the people who are leaving, speak English. That's extraordinary. And 21% speak another language. So also interesting. Now, they're more interested in politics. 90% were interested in politics. Also very, very high and very different. And then some of them, 18%, had psychological pressure because of their views on the war, or they had been arrested, 10%, were arrested at protests. And then finally, this is the thing that goes back to what I was talking about, and I think it's a little worrying. How they feel that maybe the West doesn't want them. And if you look at that study, 74% of the people who have left fear that they will encounter discrimination because they are Russian. And yet the same number, 3/4, have not encountered discrimination. So I think this is, to me, a big red flag that I fear that in the rush to support Ukrainians, and there's no doubt why many people support Ukraine, but I think it's dangerous if we begin to say, and Russians, you can't come, Russians need not apply, Russians stay out of Europe, you're all guilty. That I think is very dangerous. And I'm not trying to defend Putin or anything like that. But when I think of young Russians who feel that maybe there's not a place for them in the West, or these people who are fearing, 74% of the people who have actually voted with their feet feel that they may not be welcome. That's dangerous because I think it's going to have an effect on Russians as a whole.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we have some 30 minutes left. Is that correct? 20. So I think it's
Whatever
about that. I think it's time to keep the floor.
It might be next to the, if you turn off the other mic.
I did.
Oh, you did? Oh.
Anyway, I think it's time to give the floor to the audience. And,
Okay.
yes, please.
Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mark Kramer. Whoops. Mark Kramer from Harvard. When Putin talks about a fifth column of scum and traitors, do young people think that, especially the ones who have left, do they think that he has them in mind? And if so, how does that affect their view of Putin, even those who might have a generally either benign or at least neutral view of him?
I haven't seen any particular studies, specific studies on that, but I would have to extrapolate from what we're talking about that they would feel precisely that they are in the crosshairs as people who do not support the war and have been called scum and traitors. I mean, Putin's statement was extremely violent when he said that. And he said, that Russian people have always been able to distinguish between scum and traitors, and we will spit them out. Remember that quote, spit them out like a gnat that just happened to fly into your mouth. And that we will have a cleansing of society. And to me, that's Chiska, Chiska. And what does Chiska remind me of? Stalin. So I think the fear that there will be more repression is very high among Russians. And among the Russians that I know, they did feel threatened and Masha can address this probably better, but I do think that that's a factor. And, they were not supporting Putin, to put it mildly, a long time ago. But now I think they feel directly threatened by him.
Hi, my name is Katya.
Oh, could you wait for the mic just for a second? Sorry.
Hi, my name is Katya. I work for the Ukraine program at IRIS. This is also my friend. We're both born in Russia.
Okay.
I grew up in the halls of Echo Moskvy, and it is very sad to witness that it kicked the bucket. But the one interesting thing is, before I used to think, oh no, the opposition in Russia among the youth is considerable. And yet when the war began, and maybe this is biased because I watch, living in Ukraine, I watch Ukrainian media, I saw young people say the most horrendous stuff. You and I are witnesses to it. That young woman who told her husband, rape Ukrainian women, just don't tell me about it. Even I won't talk a kid in this college who comes from, in GW, who comes from a wealthy Russian family who constantly talks about how Americans suck, Ukraine sucks, yet he studies here. And of course, that raised a lot of suspicions because, I'll put it this way, how can we be certain that even with huge support that we give to the Russian opposition youth, that this will stick and that the ongoing kind of Russophobia that is coming out, not because they hate Russians, but because of the war, isn't going to also make them think, oh, why should we, like, they hate us, why, yeah, we're liberal, we don't like Putin, but why should we stick with the West? Clearly they don't like us either. Apologies.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what we're talking about, that the danger, if the West says, you know, all Russians are responsible for this war. If we say that, and I understand why some people say that, but I do think there's a danger in including a lot of people who don't support the war, but don't feel that they can really raise their head or their hand and say something publicly. It's, again, I go back to the United States in 9/11. You know, there was an upswelling of support for the United States. And there were flags, you know, on cars. I would say, interesting, and this is just anecdotal, but I do think this war is eliciting different feelings among Russians than Crimea. Because in Crimea, because I was there during Crimea as well, there was excitement and kind of happiness. We're taking back what is ours. And there were the flag and the, what is it, St. George? St. George, yeah, the ribbon that everybody had. And it was a joyful thing. The mood is very different now. This is not a joyful war. This is, we are going to be attacked. The West is against us. Ukraine is filled with fascists. We have to fight them. And it's getting more and more angry. So it's a very different thing. I don't know how this is all going to end. I really don't. I don't know how it will affect young people, but I'm worried because once you unleash these feelings, you know, they have a life of their own. So, Masha.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Arthur Pichotowski. I'm a sociologist. I guess the question that I had, you kind of addressed it a little bit while speaking, but it's a bunch of little questions. Do Russian youth speak up? Could Russian youth speak up? How does the West, if we are to create messages for Russian youth, what do we have to mitigate in our approach so that it is deemed as being earnest? And even if you exposed everybody to the facts today, drop pamphlets through all of Russia, would that make a difference in terms of how people perceive their situation within that society?
Wow, that's always the question. You probably can answer it better than I can. But I just think, speaking almost psychologically, I think you have to give the message that those young people are part of something that's bigger than Russia. You know, that Russia can be part, a different Russia, a newer Russia, can be part of the world. And it can be a force for good and not constantly focus on Putin. We know what he is doing is horrendous, but I think there has to be a more positive message that you can be part of Europe, you can be part of the United States and the kind of the collective West, which includes some of Asia. You know, I mean, they can improve and help Russia to become part of that. Because that's where ultimately I think their emotions are based. A lot of Russians that I know are very patriotic, but they feel that Russia, it's not the Russia that they want to live in, and yet they don't feel that they can really change it. I understand that because, you know, if voting isn't really, you know, open and honest, and non-governmental organizations are constantly being shut down and declared foreign agents. And you can try to do something on the local level in Russia, but try it on the national level, you'll be destroyed. You will be shut down immediately. So it's a strange message, but I don't think the traditional kind of propaganda from the West works either. And I do think that it has to be much more positive. There is a place for you young Russians. There is, but it's not going to be with the system that you have right now.
Mikhail Alexeyev, San Diego State University. So CNN is a global broadcasting corporation, and we focus a lot on coverage here, but apparently there's a large part of the world in which Russia denies to circumvent sanctions and other things, including big democracies like India, South Africa, Brazil, where there's either kind of neutrality or support for Russia. Is CNN reaching out to these audiences in somewhat a different maybe way to correct the stories or to present the picture of what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war, in a sense that people there develop a better understanding of the threats and dangers and to security and whole international order arising from this war?
Well, I no longer work for CNN, so this is not the official CNN position, but I would say that, the job of CNN is to cover the news, all right? There's domestic CNN, and then we also have CNN International. And when I appear on CNN, I work for both of them. And in fact, I do a lot on CNN International, which is the feed that you see around the world when you're in hotels or you're living in another country. And I think that CNN is doing a great job, quite honestly. They have more people on location in many different places in Ukraine. And sometimes now we have some in the Baltics. Russia is harder because the Russian government has made it harder to cover the news within Russia. But I think we're doing as good a job as we can. Now, who's watching? Can you actually see CNN at this point? Not so sure. It's been very difficult to actually get that signal within Russia. But I think CNN's job is simply to explain the way the war is going, the effect on civilians, and then how the world is looking at it. Now, you talk about India. Well, Indians can watch CNN, there's no question. But India and some other countries have different priorities sometimes. I think, the economic interests of countries could be different. And I think some countries also have a certain resentment of the United States for starting its own, conflicts or getting involved in conflicts that some people in other countries think were not justified. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, et cetera. So we have to deal with the legacy of American foreign policy as well. But it's not CNN's job to educate people and turn them in one position or another. This is simply to explain what's going on. And I think probably the best message is to show precisely what is happening in Ukraine. Russians don't see the victims, the Ukrainian victims. They're seeing the war essentially in Donbass, in the Russian-speaking area in the east. They're not seeing the destruction in Kyiv, they're simply not. So telling them that, I think it can be very educational if it gets through.
Thank you so much for this excellent talk. I'm Solvita Denis Lipman from Latvia, assistant professor, currently visiting researcher at NYU. You described perfect message, how to deliver this message. And to bring an example, we have in this room one excellent journalist, investigative journalist, Roman Badanin, how to deliver their messages to the Russian audiences.
Well, I think, a very interesting side effect of having people leave Russia is that you have a huge number of Russian journalists right now in Riga, in Vilnius, a lot in the Baltics. You have some people in Georgia, you have some people in Turkey. But really, in Riga especially, you have many Russian journalists who left even before the war. This is going back Crimea and before. And their ability to talk to their own citizens in the Russian language, I think is one way that the message can be gotten. Number one, it is a language. A lot of times it's online and it's very accessible on social media in various types. And the usual way that people in Russia get information is through using a virtual private network, VPN, which I'm sure, I mean, I have a VPN myself that I use which, you know, allows you to kind of pretend that you're in another place and get information. So VPNs are a very good way for Russians just to get information that would not be accessible to them in Russia. And then I think once they're technically able to get onto the internet through a VPN or another way, there's mirroring and there are other technical ways, but essentially then it's a free highway. Then they can get pretty much whatever they want. And I think that Russian journalists speaking in Russian, writing in Russian and broadcasting are going to be crucial to the future of the new Russia.
So I think we have 5 more minutes, probably the time for 2 more questions. Yes, please. And, I think we'll collect the 2 so that you can answer them, Jill, so that you can answer them together.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I sense a huge failure on the part of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, or whatever that's called these days. And I thought, you know, March 1st, let's triple that budget right off. We know that in Soviet times, 1/3 of the country listened to Voice of America, particularly the William Conover jazz program, followed by the news. And I'm wondering, how the heck are we dropping that ball? We now have 3 companies that are competing to put stratospheric drones or satellites that can overwhelm anything, including the Chinese Great Wall. So the challenge there, and we've got great personnel working at these facilities, but they're not connecting to the technology that can overwhelm any broadcast propaganda that Russia or even China wishes to impose. How are we dropping that ball? And can we pick it up soon?
Okay, and then maybe we get the second one.
Yeah. I hope this one is about the young people.
It's about young
Well, maybe, I'm sorry, we may take one more if it's about the young people.
It's about young people. Maria Konva is my name as Warwick University. My interest about the young people and their expulsion, it comes to some theories that are about authoritarian practices and expulsion of migrants. And I mean, what is happening now is historically also with Mubarak, with Assad, in other parts of the world, very much like throwing young people out because they are the ones that are the dissenting, right? And that's kind of the regime cleans itself from inside, right? So in a certain way, this is nothing new in this discussion, but your a very insightful way of showing what is the makeup of this society brings me to another question, which is about how do Western countries really deal with that? Because I mean, the previous speaker was the leader of the Belarusian opposition, and there was definitely very much like connection to the diaspora, how the diaspora can become agent of democratic change. If the makeup of people who are coming from Russia is this kind of like transactional, not very democratic, so on, it may be more difficult also for policymakers to think about them as these agents of democratization. So in a certain way, these people become caught between one world and another, right? In which there is no real space and caught in translation. So what would be your suggestion for policymakers? Probably it's a $1 million question, right? How to deal with these people who might be very helpful for Western democracies and for democratic ideas to be bounced back to Europe, but there is probably less trust in that.
Thank you very much. It's a complex question, but I would say if they are in the West, regardless of where they are, I think, you know, I would hope that we would help them, number one, to settle, because a lot of them left, as a friend of mine, left her bank account and her apartment behind. She has basically nothing. So I think it would be good to try to help them as much as possible. I also think that they are a great resource, not only for the West, many of them are IT specialists. You already saw that they're highly educated, speak, English and foreign languages. I think that they can be very useful to the countries in which they are located now. And I think for the future, it's very similar to Belarus, You look at all the people who fled Belarus, many of them, IT people, really educated, they will be wonderful for Belarus when it is, free of Lukashenko. In the meantime, they can do a lot, both domestically where they are, and because of the internet, they can be part of the discussion back in Russia and in Belarus. And I think that's the difference, that they are not, after the Bolsheviks, they left and they would have, Russians would have like a newspaper in New York, in Novosibirsk Slova. But they weren't part of the discussion. People in Riga are very much part of the discussion back in Russia. So thanks to the internet. So I think they can be very useful. On VOA, I worked for VOA for 6 years, as I said, broadcasting. I wish they would kind of organize and spend the money correctly instead of having competing organizations. I think RFERL is doing a great job. I actually look at their information. But, the old idea of like propaganda and countering what they're saying, I think is not the modern way to do it. I think you just have to it's almost impossible to counter what the Russians are saying.
No, I'm just saying.
So, well, I don't want to get into. I don't know if they're showing them or not. I would presume that they're showing them. If they're not, then they're crazy. But just telling the truth about what's going on, I think is sufficient to have some type of influence with Russians who aren't getting any of that. Or Bucha is depicted as a big lie. So, telling that part of it would be very important.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. And I think it's time for us to close this down. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.